Well, happy Thanksgiving to you and yours. I'm not going to get into any politics today, but I will give you a little bit of history. First, some personal history, then the history of Thanksgiving. Now, you could tell by the antique, fully restored radio in the background, I have always loved radio. My love for radio really began when I was a kid. I would listen to, believe it or not, even though it was way past my era, vintage old radio shows like The Shadow. The CBS Radio Mystery Theater with E.G. Marshall, which broadcast well into the early 1980s. But as a kid in the 1970s, at night, in bed with a transistor radio, E.G. Marshall scared me to sleep more than one Saturday night. Then as I got older and began to discover rock and roll radio, well, of course I liked the disc jockeys of my era, but I really was drawn to the disc jockeys that got it all started. While my friends were buying, the latest top 40, I was haunting record stores looking for old radio records of air checks from guys like Alan Freed, the Cleveland-based disc jockey who first began to play black rhythm and blues for white teenage audiences. And eventually, he started calling it rock and roll, made the jump to New York City, and the rest is history. Now, maybe it wasn't so much his on-air delivery as a disc jockey that drew me to him, but rather the way he talked to his teenage audience. He didn't talk to them like they were kids. He talked to them like they were adults, and he talked to them, not at them. And that became something that was very pivotal in my early training when I got involved in radio, to learn to talk to the audience, not at the audience. Of course, once I discovered the movie American Graffiti and Wolfman Jack, oh baby. Now, there were other radio personalities that caught my attention. Cousin Brucey at WABC in New York, the real Don Steele at KHJ in Los Angeles, but probably the radio personality that would have the greatest effect on me before Rush Limbaugh came along had to be the one and only Paul Harvey. For years, a CBS radio newsman and commentator. Being at my grandmother's home in the summer, we always had to listen to, while we had our lunch, Paul Harvey and the rest of the story. Well, today I thought for this Thanksgiving, I put together a special production using Paul Harvey and just some great visual images. Paul Harvey taking us through the history of Thanksgiving. I hope you and yours have a great Thanksgiving, and remember, get together with friends, with family, and the people who matter most to you.
Now, the rest of the story. About 22 miles northwest of Evansville on the Wabash River is New Harmony, Indiana. And New Harmony is one of the first experimental cooperative communities in the New World. It was a bold experiment for the 1820s, but the idea was far from original. Even in the United States, experiments in communism were going on long before the 19th century. I'm particularly reminded of one experiment in New England. In 1621, it was called Plymouth Colony. Paul Harvey, are you saying that our country's Pilgrim Fathers were communists? Yes. There's much misinformation about the Pilgrims, In the first place, in Philon, Wales, the butcher wrapped a purchase for Mrs. Felicia Dorothea Hemans in a newspaper. It was an old newspaper which had found its way from Boston in 1824, and it mentioned a celebration of Forefathers' Day. Based on that article, never having seen the New World, Mrs. Hemans wrote a poem immortalizing the landing of the Pilgrims. In her poem, she said, on a stern and rock-bound coast, the Pilgrims had landed on the tip of Cape Cod, not Plymouth Rock, but on a low-lying sandy beach. She said they moored their bark, because that rhymed with dark, but the Mayflower actually was square-rigged throughout. She said they sought freedom to worship God. Well, they had that freedom in Holland. No, they sought a lot more than that. And yet, despite the misleading poetical errors, it's her conception of the Pilgrims which we still revere today. Except, of course, those who read Longfellow instead, he called them Puritans. Well, the Puritans didn't arrive until 10 years after the Mayflower, and they weren't called Puritans for 20 years more. Yet, however, the poets scramble the facts. 104 men and women did reach our shores aboard the Mayflower, survived a full year and a hard winter after the landing, and then celebrated the so-called first Thanksgiving and set about on an experiment. All that they owned and all of the crops that they grew became the common property of all, and each man's task was assigned him by a central authority. And you know what? Some of the Pilgrims complained that they were too weak from want of food to tend the crops as they should. So there was increasing absenteeism. Well, at last in 1623, after much debate, Governor Bradford decided upon a new system, whereby each man should plant his own corn. Each would thereby have to trust himself for the food for his family. And it worked. Now, as Governor Bradford's diary relates, the Pilgrims went willingly into the field, and they took their little ones with them to set corn, and before, they might have alleged weakness or inability to work, and to have compelled them to work, that would have been tyranny. But now, with the incentive of more food, they worked at it, and they worked willingly. And by the time the next harvest had come, instead of famine, there was plenty. The effect of the private planting, as Governor Bradford writes, was apparent to everybody. Some of the more industrious had food to spare and to sell to others. Now, some political scientists still imagine that communism is the wave of the future. Well, now you know that it was waved in the past. It was tried. It was tried here. We in America were communists from the start. Well, I'll run that by again. We in America were communists. Communism was our very first form of government. And it might be to this day, except for one thing, it didn't work. And we rejected it. And we replaced it with something better. Now you know the rest of the story.
No, I will not, declared President Thomas Jefferson. I will not encourage the American people to pray. What he said more precisely was that civil powers alone had been given to the President of the United States, that no authority to direct the religious exercises of his constituents was given to the President of the United States. Well, churchgoers were incensed. They reminded Jefferson that President Washington had proclaimed a national day of prayer. So had President John Adams. But the third president of the United States responded firmly that the Constitution was clear on the matter. If folks wanted to pray, they'd have to do it on their own time, without his urging. And so it was through the 2 terms of Tom Jefferson. And although Madison, his successor, saw no problem with a president recommending public worship, he agreed that such a presidential proclamation would pose a constitutional disaster. Now, until Jefferson, United States presidents were actually telling people to pray. But this is the rest of the story. Once upon a time, there was a magazine editor named Sarah Josepha Hale. And Sarah Hale vigorously disagreed with Jefferson's perspective on prayer in the presidency. Americans were drifting further from God, she believed. Before they drifted too far, the president must step in and urge a renewal of that relationship. In fact, said Sarah Hale, he must proclaim a day of prayer. And Sarah used her popular Boston Ladies magazine to promote the idea. She began her crusade in 1827. Write your congressman, she told her readers. Pressure the president. And yet enamored of Tom Jefferson's perspective on the issue, the chief executives who came after him remained determined to separate church and state. But Sarah Hale refused to give up. When her magazine merged with Godey's Ladies Book of Philadelphia, Sarah found herself with 150,000 readers, and the largest periodical of its kind in the nation. And from this enlarged public pulpit, she continued to preach her sermon of government-enforced prayer. Through a lot of presidents. For nearly 40 years, Sarah Hale crusaded, writing hundreds of letters to public officials and getting her readers to write thousands. She published scorching criticisms of those who would stand in her way, and one day, her mission was accomplished. By then, our nation was at war with itself. But in 1863, President Lincoln was in particularly good spirits one day after a major Union victory at Gettysburg, and he was reading another of those insistent Sarah Hale letters which had been addressed to him personally. And this time the president gave in, and President Lincoln proclaimed a national day of prayer. And you have been observing it ever since. Oh, yes, you have. I know all of your life. You've thought of it as a tradition unbroken from the time of the early English settlers, something that may have happened back there at Plymouth Rock. But I tell you, it took a feisty New England publisher named Sarah Hale 4 decades to ensure that tomorrow, by presidential edict, you and I will bow our heads in an expression of gratitude to God in the annual American ritual we've come to know as Thanksgiving. Only now, you'll know the rest of the story.